Good morning. I am Margaret Heisel, Senior Researcher here at the Center for Studies in Higher Education at University of California, Berkeley. And today's moderator, I've been a longtime official at the UC Office of the President and have also worked in international education at the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities and NAFSA, the Association of International Educators in Washington, D.C. I want to begin by welcoming all of you who are joining us on this webinar today, focusing on the COVID-19's effects on university research and international collaboration. Our center here at Berkeley, the Center for Studies in Higher Education, has sponsored several webinars this summer, focusing on current and emerging pressing issues in higher education, many, of course, greatly intensified by COVID-19. Let me first now introduce our very distinguished and knowledgeable panelist. First, we will hear a brief introduction from James Hyatt. Jim is a senior research associate here at the Center for Studies in Higher Education, and he has extensive experience as a senior level executive at a number of major research universities, including UC Berkeley, the University of Maryland, University of Arizona, and Virginia Tech. One particularly important credential that Jim holds is that from 2008 to 2010, Jim served as president of the World Institute for Disaster Recovery Management. Our next speaker is France Cordova. France is an astrophysicist, and she was the 14th director of the National Science Foundation, NSF. France has been a leader in science, engineering, and education for 4 decades. She has a distinguished career in both higher education and government. President Emeritus of Purdue, she was Chancellor of University of California, Riverside, and she was Vice Chancellor for Research at the University of California, Santa Barbara. After France, we will hear from Randy Katz. Randy is Vice Chancellor for Research at UC Berkeley, with responsibility for Berkeley's full research endeavor. He's the United Microelectronics Corporation Distinguished Professor in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science here in Berkeley, and he has published very, very widely books, technical papers, etc. Next, we will hear from Tim Stearns. He is Senior Associate Dean for Research and Professor of Genetics and Biology at Stanford University. Tim also holds the Frank Lee and Carol Hall Professorship at Stanford University, and he is chair of the Department of Biology. Plus, he holds appointments in the Department of Genetics and is a member of the Stanford Cancer Institute. He has been an advisor to the National Academies of Science and to the President's Council of Advisors in Science and Technology. Finally, we will hear from Professor David Bogle in London. He is Provost of the University College London Doctoral School, where he leads the strategy for early career researcher development, both at the doctoral and postdoctoral level. At UCL, Professor Bogle is also chair of the League of European Research Universities and Doctoral Studies Policy Group. Again, a very important post. So, now we turn to the subject. You are going to hear today about the impact of COVID-19 on university research across the academic disciplines. Here are measures taken to support programs and shifts in research agendas to meet current challenges. With the inability to travel and new federal regulations, we will hear assessments of the role, the nature, and the value of international collaborations and how these agreements are being adapted to current and future circumstances. Just a couple of points regarding the logistics of our webinar. Each of the panelists will speak for 7 to 10 minutes, and we will then open the floor to questions. Some of you have already submitted questions as one step in your registration, but all of you are welcome to submit questions during the webinar via the chat function at the bottom right of your computer screen. I will raise these questions with panelists. Finally, you should know that this webinar will be archived on the site of the Center for Studies in Higher Education here at UC Berkeley. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Margaret. There are two important aspects of COVID-19 crisis. The first is the need for the immediate challenge of COVID-19 in terms of the workplace, the COVID-19 related research, and international collaborations. Second, the future of research given the impact of the global economic recession. I'll rely on the other panel members to respond to how their respective universities are responding to the immediate crisis posed by COVID-19. I'd like to focus my attention on the second major challenge, which is how our universities preparing for the fiscal impact of the accompanying economic recession. From experience, we know that such recessions can impact public or governmentally supported universities differently than private universities. For example, during the Great Recession of 07-08, the impact was immediate on both types of institutions, but while private universities generally recovered more quickly as the market and the economy improved, the recovery of public universities took a much longer period of time since they were more reliant on governmental support. Several major research universities also took advantage of low interest rates to invest in infrastructure and facilities to support their research activities. Public universities also took advantage of governmental stimulus programs to also invest in research facilities and in infrastructure, particularly in the health sciences area. While the impact of the current recession was immediate, particularly given COVID-19, it's time to assess both the challenges and opportunities of conducting future research and strengthening international collaboration. From the perspective of supporting research, there have been several major changes in higher education recently, in the recent time. The cost of major research projects have grown significantly. Consequently, there are currently more efforts involving consortiums of universities, both domestically and internationally. The University of Arizona, where I was the Senior Vice President for Finance, is currently part of a consortium that is involved in constructing the Giant Magellan Telescope. Consortium members include the University of Arizona, Harvard University, University of Chicago, Korea Astronomy and Space Science Institute, Astronomy Australia Limited, the Smithsonian Institution, and the Carnegie Observatories. This consortium has several lessons that could be helpful in rethinking how future research initiatives could be funded. First, the consortium includes a combination of support from universities, governments, and private philanthropy. Second, each partner of the consortium contributes both financial support as well as technical expertise. The University of Arizona, for example, is providing the mirrors that are a key component of the telescope. Third, there is a core organization that handles all the financial, administrative, and operational support involved in constructing the telescope. So each institution is not dependent on doing that. It has an organization that's been established that's overseen by the consortium members to handle most of the logistics, finance, and construction. As we look to the future, it's clear that major research projects, such as the Giant Magellan Telescope, are too expensive to be the sole responsibility of any single university. Furthermore, in the age of global communications and technology, it's now possible and desirable to engage in research regardless of place or time. The current efforts related to COVID-19 confirm this hypothesis. According to a recent report of the American Institute of Physics, the pandemic, this is a quote, the pandemic has opened opportunities to convene scientists in new ways, making use of new technologies that shrink distances and enable new forms of interpersonal interaction across miles. Social distancing and other pandemic countermeasures, such as virtual meetings, have illuminated the increasing interconnectedness of science, the important roles played by each field of science, as well as the challenges and opportunities associated with new ways of connecting scientists. So I think you need to look at the COVID-19 as certainly a major challenge, but it's also a major opportunity. And we saw that as part of the Great Recession of 07-08. People rethought how they did things and how they could do it with limited resources and more reliance on consortiums. And so I think that is the future moving forward. And I'll now turn it over to the other panel members. Thank you. Okay. I think, Randy, it's you.
Actually, I believe it's France who
Oh, it's Francis. I'm sorry, Francis. It is you. Okay. I mean, it's you. Right. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Okay.
great. Let me just say hello to everyone and welcome to all the people listening today. My comments will draw on observations that are gleaned from various webinars and surveys, including recent online events, all of which I participate in and which are focused on COVID-19 and its impacts. Among these is a report published in early July by a task force convened by the American Institute of Physics, chaired by Julia Phillips, which emphasizes the impacts of the coronavirus on the workforce, on infrastructure, and on the conduct of research. And I was a member of that task force. In late July, COSMPOP, the policy arm of the National Academies, explored challenges and solutions among scientists involved in research, teaching, and policy. I contributed a talk in one of the sessions. NASM President McNutt described the pandemic as a magnifying force, exacerbating trends that are already challenging universities. A US investment analyst noted, quote, "The pandemic is likely to hasten some trends and hatch others." And I thought those were good words, hasten some trends and hatch others. Looking back at 20 years from now, that might not be a bad summary. Certainly, previous pandemics did exactly that. We recognize that arguably the biggest current impact of COVID on science is its impact on the scientific workforce. This is the lifeblood of the research enterprise. It particularly affects students, early career researchers, and faculty. In many instances, hiring has been curtailed and laboratory and field work, both at home and abroad, have been interrupted. We're losing continuity of important longitudinal data about the planet, about the universe. The pandemic affects the use of infrastructure, and we heard about that from Jim Hyatt just a minute ago. That's facilities, research centers, laboratories that are needed for scientists to make discoveries. Many large facility projects of NSF, NASA, and DOE are much delayed. We know, for example, the James Webb and Vera Rubin telescopes are delayed in construction, and the Antarctica Modernization Construction Program has been halted to avoid contaminating that continent. The pandemic affects international partnerships and the flow of international students. Arguments for the value of international students were given in a July New York Times article by President Raphael Reif of MIT. Quote, "We will never have all the talent, all the ideas, all the capacity to go it alone," said MIT Vice President for Research Maria Zuber. And Artie Bienenstock of Stanford has focused on the essential need to collaborate internationally on large facilities, which are highly productive, but cost a lot. The biggest international impact is the changes in globalism. One economist described globalism as the heart of today's interconnected world, quote, "with the mutual dependence among economies, companies, and consumers," unquote. This is coming apart because of economic and political forces. For science, COVID presents travel, supply chain, and construction challenges to international negotiation and collaboration. Everyone I've interacted with finds that the pandemic exacerbates the disadvantages underrepresented minorities, women, and the LGBTQ community already face. Many scientists have noted that the level of disruption for women and young children is enormously greater than for anyone else. Balancing childcare, working, and keeping everyone safe and healthy are great challenges for parents, and particularly that burden falls on women. The early stage investigator is especially vulnerable. While a survey of hundreds of high energy physicists reveals an overall 72% productivity rate compared with pre-COVID, some individuals say that they are less than 20% productive. The pandemic further inhibits the ability of the nation to increase its skilled technical workforce, as this often requires hands-on training. This is an impediment too to productivity. The National Science Board has produced an important report on the US need for more skilled technical workers. So let me now mention the financial impacts at home. On the plus side, Congress is appropriating more funding, some $20 billion to agencies for COVID-related research, with the preponderance going to health and biomedical agencies like CDC and NIH. Many researchers and facilities pursuing other purposes have pivoted to COVID research. However, there continue to be important focuses in the physical sciences. DOE, NSF, and NASA continue to fund projects related to global competitiveness, like space flights to the International Space Station and Mars, clean energy, physics facilities, and quantum computing. Other countries wanting to maintain competitive status are spending in similar areas. For example, recent articles focus on China and Europe's expensive forays into space and quantum science. The biggest financial distortion coming out of COVID may not be the extra money appropriated to address the virus right now, but later on, the extra costs due to delays of large projects, as well as extra costs to assist struggling educational institutions. The pandemic is affecting the financial wherewithal of universities. Some colleges, we're told, may not make it financially. A recent estimate by Peter McPherson, head of the APLU, projected his organization's 246 members will face around $45 billion in lost revenue and additional expenses this year. COVID is impacting smaller, high-risk, high-tech startups. Financial investors are betting on more secure industries rather than the risk-taking, potentially high-reward endeavors that have made our country a unique contributor to progress. Fortunately, SBIR STTR funding from the federal agencies appears to be still going strong. The pandemic affects scientific societies that are the connective tissue that bring people together to learn and be inspired. We know that these conferences that they sponsor generate revenues for the societies, as of course do subscription publications. And that world too is in turmoil, with increased emphasis to reduce paywalls and publish openly and free. The pandemic affects the very conduct of research, how scientists and their students communicate, engage, and make discoveries serendipitously in personal encounters. And this offers both challenge and opportunity to many educators. Some of this change will be good. For example, opening meetings to wider public lectures, previously heard by only a few in closed setting. They can now be heard by hundreds. I attended one lecture on black holes that engaged over 1,000 participants. Online venues can engage people more widely in thinking about solutions to problems. More people from different disciplines are throwing their ideas and time into producing solutions for treatment of the virus, for example. As one researcher has noted, it's the reemergence and acceleration of convergence. The challenge to better understand COVID and its mysteries is drawing in a wide array of scientific actors to converge with purpose from all disciplines. The necessity of going to online education has accelerated positive aspects of distance learning and unleashed hybrid models for education. Carl Wyman of Stanford has been emphasizing for a long time the learning sciences. During COVID, he introduced more effective ways for physics students at Stanford to collaborate and learn online. And almost daily, I see articles from universities and how they're reinventing courses that have traditionally been hard to teach online. Yet the students miss the hands-on interactive teaching, say some university professors. One such scientist described corridors at her university as having, quote, one-way signs. In such a situation, how can you run into people and share spontaneous ideas, she said. So there are both negative and positive impacts of COVID. We have hope that with good ideas and working together in new ways, we'll meet the current challenges and come out stronger. Yet there's no escaping that we've lost much, and the loss continues. We don't know where the end of the COVID tunnel is. We do know that science and the scientific method have much to offer now. Because of this crisis, the world is recognizing the importance of science. Indeed, many governors and state officials say, I'm going to look to the science in making my decision. The scientists are the heroes now, said one prominent bioscientist to me. She said that on the day that Dr. Fauci threw out the first pitch at the Washington Nationals game. Scientists are essential to understanding the root cause of the pandemic and essential to finding ways to conquer it. Science gives us hope that working together we'll get past this moment. And the excitement of science and its role today may inspire more young people to want to become scientists. We have a lot to learn from the changes to our lives and economy that the pandemic has wrought. Importantly, we've learned that we were not adequately prepared for this pandemic. Science, if it is strategically organized, can help us be prepared for future disruptive events, including pandemics. The importance of continuity of funding, taking the long view and funding for preparedness has never been clearer. Thank you, and I'll now turn this over to Randy Katz.
Thank you, France, and thanks, Jim, for queuing up my comments. I would like to take the perspective from individual campus and our response to COVID-19 and our recovery from it, but it's also informed by many discussions broadly across the Vice Chancellor for Research, Vice President for Research networks, both within the University of California, the AAU and APLU. If you go back and look, sort of step into the time machine to the middle of March, California was the first state to do a statewide shutdown around March 18th, I believe. And so we had approximately 48 hours to completely shut down our campus research enterprise, which meant closing down our laboratories and restricting activity in those labs that were allowed to continue to only the most essential kinds of activities, like those which were required to maintain critical research capabilities, the machinery that had to be babysat and the animal colonies that had to be sustained. This affected all elements of our research enterprise, from laboratory to social science to human subjects and so on. We paused our field research as well. And of course, this led to tremendous disruptions in international collaborations. Our researchers could not travel, or researchers could not travel to Berkeley for collaboration. And what has developed over the last several months are some incredibly disruptive workforce issues as we move into our fall semester, which for Berkeley begins in another week. We still have incoming graduate students who are stranded in their home countries, unable to join us on campus to join research programs or to participate in their degree programs and so on. And sort of from a process perspective, being able to just manage bureaucratically these kinds of issues has been extremely challenging for our university and for every major university in the United States, if not internationally. As the pandemic continued and we had an optimistic perspective on it in the June timeframe, we allowed our campus research activity to ramp back. And using the guidance of the public health authorities of limiting standard density to about 25% of normal, we established a process on campus to essentially manage density in those research areas on our campus where the kind of work that was being done could not be done anywhere else. So this means essentially restarting laboratory, lab-intensive kind of research. This, of course, begs the question of working remotely when you're not in a laboratory-based discipline. And France has already described some of the productivity issues that our faculty have been experiencing, our researchers. We have not been able to provide the kind of access to archival material and library materials that would be the situation under normal circumstances. So indeed, this has had a deep impact on many areas of the research activity of the university. To pop up and sort of think a little bit about the university response, it's remarkable to see the shift in the research agenda. The sort of research community on university campuses have really stepped up, and infectious disease research, which of course was always an area of some level of interest, has become a prime area of interest, and it has exposed some of the limitations of our campus research facilities to support that kind of research, particularly biological containment facilities that we have on campus, BSLs. And this is having an effect not just in the life sciences. Our public health researchers, our engineering researchers, our social scientists, our economists are all drawn into the societal challenge that COVID-19 represents and trying to bring to bear their expertise to understand it. The universities themselves have been a microcosm of response. Our research labs, our high throughput research labs used for kind of exploring genetic variation have been turned into COVID-19 testing labs. And this is not unique to Berkeley. It's very common across the university complex that in fact, in the fall of 2020, we're depending upon our research labs to provide a low-cost testing capability for our campus community. And again, our public health experts and life scientists have stepped forward to participate in, for example, an all Bay Area epidemiological study to really understand the dynamics of the infection. Now, of course, as France mentioned, there's been a significant increase in life sciences and infectious disease research funding. Just as one example, our NIH funding on the Berkeley campus increased 28% in more or less over the last 6 months. And this has placed tremendous demands on campus research infrastructure, as I've mentioned. This leads to some thinking about longer term impacts, and perhaps we can discuss this, when we go more into a panel session, which is really, will we return to, that wonderful interaction that people have in the corridors that are now one way? By the way, that's how our buildings are set up right now. All the flow in the buildings is one way to avoid contact. So how can we best support remote collaborative work? What happens if individuals are not able to travel to research facilities? What are the implications for the automation in those laboratories, robotics in the lab or in the field? There's some new opportunities and new ways that we need to be thinking about access to be able to perform our research. What about supply chain resilience, and in particular in our research workforce? International researchers are so absolutely critical to, and our open environment and attraction of the world's best talent to the United States is extremely important. But we've discovered the complexity of running an international activity in the world in which COVID-19 now exists, which shut down the ease of international travel. How do we rethink some of those things? Research versus operations and the infrastructure for the next pandemic. So at least in California, this is actually the third and worst of 3 disasters that have taken place over the last 18 months. The first one was an air quality disaster due to fires in Northern California. The second one was the public safety power shutdowns, where our local power authority disconnected the university from power supplies. And now each one of those lasted for a few days. Now we've really been facing something that's literally lasted for months. What is the next disaster? Are we ready for it if it's an earthquake in Northern California or something like that? So research resilience as a national need has become extremely important. And then the last point I want to raise is balancing the research portfolio. We're so shaped by the response to COVID-19, the funding opportunities and so on. How is that distorting the activity of our faculty? These are important things to address, but the importance of balance, the importance of thinking about, what the societal impacts will be, as we face the next set of challenges to society. We want to ensure a good balance in the sort of research activities that are underway. So these are just some of the longer term impacts and challenges that I hope we'll have a chance to discuss a bit more. So with that, I'd like to actually turn the discussion over to my colleague from Stanford, Tim.
Thank you very much, Randy. I appreciate hearing from my colleague in the Bay Area and hearing what Berkeley is doing. So I'm here to give the perspective of a scientist, educator, and also a research administrator at Stanford University, which of course is a private research university, as well as my experience as an advisor to the US government on science, technology, and national security. I'm going to base my comments on a single theme, and it's really a question, which is, does a pandemic call for a more introspective view or a more global outward-facing view from research universities? I'm going to start from sort of the inward facing and talk about some of the challenges that the pandemic has posed and some of the response of the university. So at the campus level, we definitely have seen that there is tension between the need to get lab research started up again and all of the other forms of research that are non-lab research, which still are unable to access our campus at the current state of campus access that's allowed by state and county regulations and our interpretation of them. This is a problem because many people, even though they can accomplish their work off campus, feel that access to campus and the interactions that happen there are really integral to their work. There's also a sense that there is heightened student distrust of the administration. And this comes from both the undergraduate and graduate level. And I think part of it is that the university has been faced with making many important decisions that affect the lives of undergraduates and graduate students, as we're seeing play out right now with decisions of universities with respect to bringing students back or not for the fall, and grading policies for students, policies associated with graduate students working in labs. These are all critically important. A related problem that we've seen is that the normal communication channels that we use at universities have failed to get the information down to all relevant parties. And when we're talking about critically important information as it relates to a pandemic and the response to it, this is really highlighted. And we are thinking hard about how to do better with that. And of course, working with the realization that there are many forms of communication now that can take place, not just email or websites, and that we really should be using all of those resources to maximally affect our ability to get information to people. Another thing we have seen on campus, and of course it's happening across the country, is that there is a renewed interest and commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion. Students are deeply interested in this, as well as faculty and administrators. It's important to do better communicating what we already do at universities with respect to these issues, and to do even better than we are currently doing by reviewing our practices and thinking harder about how we can make for more diverse professoriate and do better in our classrooms with equity and inclusion. There's also, of course, new opportunities that come from remote education, research, and administration. Now, like many campuses, we had already started programs to allow administrative staff to work from home. And it's clear now that, of course, that much of that kind of work really can be done very effectively and efficiently from home. It's hard to imagine that we would go back on that. I think that will be a new normal for campuses. Another thing we've noted, as you might anticipate, is that there's been a real stress on computing resources at the university, because much of the work from home that researchers can do involves computation. And that really has been a driver for us to commit to expanding our computational resources. So that's the campus. What about the local community? Stanford, of course, exists in a community in the Bay Area, in the San Francisco Bay Area, south of the Berkeley campus, in a more sort of suburban area, just north of Silicon Valley. And we have to think of the perception of the role of a large private research university in that community context. Clearly, it's a major employer, but is it more? So there are two areas where we really have done, I think, very well with respect to interacting with the community. One is in medical care. Stanford Health Center has provided extremely important medical care and COVID-19 testing to the local community. Another, which I think we can do better in, is science outreach. And we really need to help promote trusted voices, which I'll return to later in science, coming from the campus out to the local community. The Bay Area, of course, also has tremendous income disparity, rather short geographical distances. And we think that social science research and applications facilitated by advances in artificial intelligence will be critical to addressing these disparities, which are at play so clearly in the Bay Area. Now, if you move to the national level, right, so the view of a research campus looking out at the national level, we of course see that there's tremendous political polarization of things like science and technology that were not as politicized in the past. And this polarization has resulted in there no longer really being universally trusted sources for information. So as scholars, how do we break through that? And we know this is critically important because we see evidence that the federal government has only limited input from scientists in decision making. How do we help to ensure that science informs policy decisions that affect the lives of everyone in the US? How can we better marshal the incredible research capacity of universities in response to emergencies such as pandemics? And should that include closer work with the national laboratories that are in DOE and the biotech and pharmaceutical industries? And as most people know, the Bay Area is particularly rich in these, having extremely strong academic labs, having national labs, Lawrence Berkeley, Lawrence Livermore, and SLAC, and of course, the amazing biotechnology industry that is based in the Bay Area as well. Then move to the international level. Now, of course, it is trite but true that infectious disease does not respect borders, and that we have a more globally mobile human population than we ever have before. So clearly there is need for more international collaboration. But at the same time, we have factors that are making that collaboration more difficult. There is great concern about the rise of science in particularly China with respect to the US and how that relates to national security and economic security of the US. There is concern about some programs that other countries have, and again, China has been the focus of this, but it shouldn't be the only place we are looking. Programs that have ties, that scholars who come to the US have ties to their home country and the way information is transmitted. We're talking about fundamental research here. Those are driving a lot of changes in the way that we assess foreign engagements. And some of those have the potential to make life difficult for universities which thrive on foreign collaborations and foreign students, the best foreign students coming to the US to be trained and contribute to our research enterprise. These are serious problems to address. Of course, science has always existed in a situation where geopolitics do matter, and this is no different. It seems to be particularly heightened now, and we have to work within that constraint at universities. The other point is, how do we deal with issues around scientific openness? Again, we typically in fundamental research community, we believe that the openness of science is a critically important feature. And yet there are, again, concerns that have caused discussion about whether we should change that policy of openness. I'll just end with a quick few notes about things that we are doing at Stanford. So one is that we've realized that enhancing the flexibility of faculty research is critically important. Faculty wanted to pivot to be able to research based on COVID-19 and the pandemic, not just in biology, but also in social science and the humanities. We need to be able to facilitate that at the university level. One way we can facilitate that is by providing seed grants to people. Another way is that we can provide the strongest shared facilities possible to help leverage the federal investment in research, such that faculty can do an even better job on their research. Another is that we have just undergone a long-range planning exercise at Stanford, and one of the things it settled on is sustainability as a major theme for research in the future at Stanford. The discussion of how to implement that is still ongoing, but we view that as a broad area that encompasses many of the things that are of concern: climate change, energy, infectious disease, and human resilience as well, that have been raised by the pandemic. And we look forward to working at all of those levels that I discussed to try to make the human condition better, which is, I think, the goal of research universities. Thanks, and I will now turn it over to David.
Great, thanks very much. You see from the bio, I'm the international speaker for this. I'm speaking from the UK. I'm what we call Pro Vice Provost, the Graduate Dean at University College London. And I'm going to talk just briefly about three things. I'll talk a bit about my university, a bit about the UK situation, which I think has some particular challenges, and a little bit about the European situation. I have various roles within aspects of Europe as well. So we're about my university, University College London. The UK is currently, things are very quiet for us in August, and the undergraduates don't come back until the end of September on the whole. So we are just starting to, well, they've been kicking back in again, all the labs and so on over the last 6 to 8 weeks, but everything is very quiet at the moment. But over the period, we took a whole series of actions. Some of the things Randy was talking about are very, very similar. We were extending stipends and timings. Interestingly, not all of the students by any means wanted the extensions, the stipend extensions. So it's a very mixed picture of what individuals might need for their particular project. But obviously all field work, conferences are on hold. So a lot of the networking is really undercut at the moment. And the hardest hit undoubtedly have been the laboratory scientists, those needing to interview people, and those needing to go into archives, particularly obviously archives without digital access, and they have been heavily affected. Same is sort of broadly true of the early career researchers, the postdocs, time extensions. The government had this big furlough scheme, but it wasn't really very appropriate for researchers where they were paying for salary levels. So there's a very significant concern, as somebody before said, about the ability to deliver the projects, the large project portfolio that we have. In terms of how it's affecting international collaboration, I have no data on that at the moment, but my impression is that the existing collaborations are working well, because all of the digital communications, one of the big things, of course, we found about this is that we can do these sorts of things so much more easily than we thought. So my impression is that the existing ones are working well, but new ones are not being generated. And that seems to be particularly true with the developing world. Before the pandemic hit, for UCL, it was about 6% of our co-publication was with European countries, but the largest was Germany, 8%. North America, 20%, but the largest was the US, 15%. So the US is a very important collaborator, of course, for us in the UK, and that's probably fairly typical. Recruitment is actually very strong for the autumn. Applications, offers, and acceptances are all up on last year. So the concerns, the very major concerns about will people come, seem not to be happening, but of course we'll have to see what happens. It's very difficult for postdocs, as I think France was saying. That is the big problem for the research staff. The opportunities for them, if their grant's coming to an end, new PhD students wanting postdoc positions, very difficult situation, both within the universities, but also beyond academia as well. And a particular problem for us in the UK with 32% of our postdocs are European citizens. I'll come back to that one in a second. We have a large portfolio of COVID projects. I just wanted to mention, somebody asked something about intellectual property, and there was a very interesting situation of something that came up, this continuous positive airway pressure device developed by some people in mechanical engineering. And within 2 weeks, they'd sorted out free access, free licenses for 2 years, and 105 countries have taken that up. So you can sort out intellectual property quite quickly if you really want to. So let me talk now a bit about the UK position, and that the big problem there is uncertainty. We are in a hugely uncertain situation, and the pandemic is just one of them. So the pandemic is one. You will be aware that the UK has decided to leave the European Union, so this Brexit is having potentially huge effect on the university system. We are likely to have a major economic recession. The GDP is down 20% this quarter. Of course, nobody knows what's going to happen, but it looks not good. And a good thing is that we have a new chief executive of our main government research organisation, the UK Research and Innovation, and that will change research priorities a little bit. And Ottoline is particularly keen to improve the culture of research. I'll come back to that in a second. So, just as France said, real evidence that the women carers and minorities are particularly being hit, acutely affected by this. So the UK wishes to spend its way out of these problems by aiming for spending more on research and development. They aimed 2.4% of GDP on research and development. That's been in the industrial strategy for some time, and want to see science as part, anyway, of getting us out of this. But and a very significant R&D growth is promised. But will it happen? That's a big question. What was it Tim saying about, you were saying something about some distrust of the administration. Well, of course, we have some distrust of, let's say, of governments as well, as whether they will deliver on what they're saying. So we just don't know, but a very, very significant increase is what's promised. Who knows? They've also promised visa things to be much more straightforward, because we have this big problem that so many of our early career researchers are European. They will require a visa in future, Europeans, whereas at the moment they don't require it. We don't have to have any, we don't have to do any tests, and this could have a major impact. To me, this is the biggest impact for universities of Brexit. And well, I don't know, maybe it's not more than the pandemic, but it's really the big impact on Brexit. So if they really do make this easier for us to recruit from Europe, which we have been very strong at doing because people do want to come to the UK, all well and good. And then the last thing, we'll mention that it's highlighted a major structural flaw in our system. I think this is similar to the US, that basically overseas taught students, undergraduate and master's students, have been subsidizing our research activity. We lose on all research, we gain on overseas students. And there's some real questions to be had about that, particularly if we lose overseas. So the Brexit will potentially lose access to the European Union schemes. We don't know, that's up in the balance at the moment. And the key about that is not about money, it's about collaboration. As I said, 56% of our publications, international publications, were co-authored with people within Europe. It has been incredibly easy to collaborate with the European colleagues because you don't have the double jeopardy problem. You go to the European funding scheme, you're all going together. You don't have to get from one national agency and another and try and make those work at the whole time. So this is a hugely uncertain effects on collaboration, on postdoc recruitment, and on mobility in general. The government, as part of its interest in changing research, in increasing research, is to try and lower the concentration on what's called the Golden Triangle. A very, very significant amount of the research money goes into the southeast of England, particularly Oxford, Cambridge and London. Particularly the big four are Oxford, Cambridge, University College and Imperial College. We all get about the same, more or less, and it's significantly more than the others. And the government would like to see more investment, particularly in the north of England, to try and re-stimulate the economy. So that will be interesting to see what happens, but that could encourage greater collaboration within the nation, not necessarily outside. Final little bit about the UK situation. The charities have been very heavily affected, of course, and industry support is dropping as well. The last thing I wanted to say about the UK was Ottoline Laser arriving as chief executive of UKRI, very keen to improve research culture, which has become hyper-competitive, toxic in many ways, particularly for early career researchers, and indeed for more senior ones as well. So she wants things to be more collaborative, more open science, that was mentioned before, more transparency on research careers, and more independence for postdocs. At the moment, you know, they do almost what their PI tells them to do. We need to be training them and allow them to have much more independence. And I think that will include more collaboration overseas. But so we need these researchers we know most of them are not going to stay in the academy. We need to be training them to be innovators in society. We train them well on research. Do we train them well enough on innovation? I wonder. So last few points about Europe. European schemes aim to be very global. They have associated states. I think there's rules by which the United States can be involved, but there's a big debate going on about budget. It's the current plan is 80 billion euros over the next framework program, which I think is 5 years, which was considerably less than what the community was after. So we'll have to see what happens. But there's some really good schemes within Europe that really encourage independence for postdocs. The Marie Curie Skłodowska scheme in particular really allows them to fly in an early way. Somebody mentioned the parallels with the earlier recession. It's not quite the same in Europe because so much of we rely very little on philanthropic support, which was the thing that was really hit by the recession. The states, the UK, Germany and France all stepped up and really pretty much maintained the science budget. So that's been quite sort of healthy over the last 10 years in spite of lots of austerity within the system. Industry support weakening a bit around Europe, I've seen. So I think I'll stop there, but my impression is that all the research intensive universities within the UK and across Europe are very keen to keep up the international collaboration since, as I think Tim said, the grand challenges are mostly common for us all. So I'll pass back to Margaret, I think, now, and we might have some questions.
Thank you so much, all of you, and I'm very sorry that I've had this internet problem. As you probably know, as a part of the registration process, we'd like to have a bit of discussion now, questions that have been raised by listeners. As a part of the registration process, we have had questions, and if anyone wishes to ask now, they can use the chat function by putting in their email and giving us a question on the chat function. In the meantime, I will raise one question that we received early, and that is, they ask for a kind of comparison among nations in their policies with regard to university research during the pandemic, and whether some nations have had better or worse policies that have benefited or particularly damaged research. Is there any of you have any comment on that subject?
Well,
Randy, you go. Okay.
If I could jump in on this one, the NIH, well, Office of Management and Budget, but in particular NIH has been very flexible in terms of how funding can be spent. You could imagine that there are researchers who were denied access to laboratories and could not make progress on their projects. Some agencies demanded that those progress be made or return the funds, and other agencies were flexible about maintaining the research capability. NIH is a great example, NSF and so on. So this is a positive policy that the government put forward. It was revised within the last month. It's more restrictive now, and it is a great concern for the US research enterprise, this more strict language associated with the guidance on how funds could be spent.
So I'll make a comment too. From what I've seen, it's had a very similar effect around all the major European countries. What has been different is the amount of flexibility that funders will allow. And the most successful ones are the ones who, I think, are the ones that are really allowing flexibility in end dates and extensions and all those sorts. Surprisingly, the European Commission has not extended in the way that most of the national agencies have. So the one country that's very different to everybody else is Sweden, which didn't have a formal lockdown. But to be honest, my understanding is that the universities, and particularly the Karolinska Institute, broadly speaking, did follow very similar patterns to what we've seen and what we've heard about this morning.
Any other comments? Thank you, David and Randy. let me raise another question that has been sent to us earlier. And what they are asking is what each of you foresees as the long-term future consequences of the effect of the pandemic on research. Now, obviously, there's been a shift into biological and that sort of research, and also practically every university has taken a big financial hit. But how do you see us emerging from this? Have there been innovations about collaboration online that will be a promising future trend?
Two things. The first is obviously the way that we use space will change radically. Space within our campuses, you know, where I don't know about you, but certainly most universities in cities have real major problems about how they can fit things in. And obviously there will be much more people working at home, people coming and going more. I think this will really change, and how we get back to having informal and formal interactions that are made flexibly and efficiently could really change the estate of many of our universities. It will take a little while, but I can see some radical change there. The other radical change I would like to see, and I really hope it does happen, is this problem for early career researchers. They are hitting a big storm, huge problems about their where they will go in the short term. But we already know there's a major problem, particularly in the life and laboratory sciences, of very poor culture, poor working environment, poor, you know, in some cases, abuse of their time. And I really hope that it will make us really think about how we can make this more open and inclusive, and a more positive work environment, because we are putting them off at the moment.
Let me comment on one other thing here. And this was raised by Randy and by Tim both. We have emergency preparedness plans for the universities I've worked at, but we didn't contemplate the impact globally at all. I mean, you know, when Randy talked about the earthquakes, fires, and that sort of thing, those are things that we were prepared for. We had practice exercises, sorts of things. Our global pandemic, the closest that you came was SARS, where you had restrictions on students coming in and that sort of thing, but not how you prepared for it. So I think that we need to really think those emergency preparedness plans, particularly related to research, because it does have a big impact. The other thing that Tim had said was the whole issue of sustainability of research. We tend in some ways to be very reactive to what's happening currently. And what we don't really tend to think more about, and we should, is how do we sustain things in the long run? And so I think there needs to be more emphasis on how we sustain research, how it's changing, how we embrace what's happened relative to the COVID-19. I think that's very important for universities to take responsibility for.
Excellent comments. Oh, France, go ahead.
Well, I just really quickly, I do think that the classroom of the future is really changing, and a lot of professors have put an awful lot of time into thinking about hybrid models of education, and just I've seen amazingly creative ways of interacting with students and getting them to interact with each other and so forth. And I think some of those will translate into the future, and that the changes in education that some people have been calling for a very long time have necessarily been accelerated, and I think that's a positive trend.
Right.
I would add to France's comments and say that some of those same things are true of the way we communicate science among scientists. So science meetings have completely changed in the last 6 months, of course. The summertime is usually a time when scientists travel around the world to attend meetings with colleagues that they normally don't see in person. And they share information and give talks, have poster sessions, trainees get to meet other trainees, more well-known scientists in their field. Hugely important for the way that science operates. Of course, we haven't been able to do any of that this year. But what has happened is that we have seen both formal meetings move to online in ways that seem to work reasonably well, but also to have seminar series in particular areas of research that allow people internationally to communicate science without anything having happened like this in the past. Of course, we have the problem of time zones. For me, there's a particular seminar series that I attend that is run by a person in the UK, actually, and it requires that I start at 7 a.m. But still, we never had this opportunity before, really. We could have, but it wasn't something that we thought was critically important, given that we had in-person science meetings. So I think that's a really valuable thing that has come from the work from home time that we have had.
Thank you very much, all of you. I want to just thank you very warmly for this wonderful conversation that we have had today. Thank you very much. We have reached 12:30, and so I'm afraid, unfortunately, we must end the webinar, but thank you very much, and I'm very sorry I was having such internet problems. But thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.